In this lesson, we'll look at how we can use CSS to create auto-centering content for our pages. In CSS, there's no single command, no single rule we can use to create auto-centering content. However, there is a very simple workaround that we can use based on the concept of the box model that will allow us to accomplish the same thing. Let's take a look in the Project Files folder for Chapter 8 and open up both the lesson_06 home.htm and accompanying CSS file in our HTML editor. And let's open the HTML file in a web browser so that we can see how the page looks. Now this page, which looks like the one we generated in the previous lesson, spans the width of the entire browser. Now, we might like to tighten this page up a bit so that it would look a little bit like this, or pretty close to it, but have an equal amount of space on both the right and left-hand side of the screen, and allow all of the page content to automatically stay together and find the center of the page and stay there. Well, how do we do that? We have several divs and an image, all organized on this page using different mechanisms such as float to get content where we want it. How do we get all of this content to stay together and stay in the middle of the page? Well, as you might have been thinking already, since we're using divs to position the contents of our page, why can't I create one big div that encompasses everything on my page and apply some attributes to that one great big div, such as margin on both the left and right-hand side, so that I would have an equal amount of margin on either side of the page and hence accomplish centering of the contents of that div. That workaround will allow us to have our elements grouped together and always in the middle of the page. Let's take a look at how we can do that. Inside my CSS file for Lesson 6, we'll scroll down and find the IDs we use for layout and formatting, and we'll add a new ID, which will link into a div by using an attribute, and we'll call this ID something logical, bearing in mind the names of our other IDs. Since my other IDs distinguish between types of content, I'll just call this one ID, which will encompass all of my page content, simply content. And I'll type my opening curly bracket, and I'll type my closing curly bracket before I forget. And within the curly brackets, I'll define a width of 800 pixels. Because I believe that will lock down a width that will group all of our items together, but yet still allow them to behave the way that they are intended to behave based on the other rules which we've already defined. So if I save this CSS file and switch over to my HTML file, which I'm doing from the window menu, I now need to get all of my page content, which is my banner graphic at the top, my side content div, my main content div, and my footer content into this one great big content div. And I'll do so by scrolling back up and finding the first element that I wish to place within this new content div. So after the body tag, I'll add a few returns, and then add my new div tag and give it an ID with the name content, which we just defined in our CSS file a moment ago. I'll also scroll down to the bottom of my page and put the closing div tag after our footer div tag. Now, if we save this file and switch over to our web browser and hit reload, and if I expand my browser window a little bit, I can see that the main content, side content, and main banner graphic and footer content are all constrained vertically. They are not allowed to exceed 800 pixels because our content div is restricting all of them because they are all contained within the content div. But it's not auto-centering. But one step at a time, And I'm taking this very rigid, small step approach on purpose, because if something goes wrong, it's much easier to identify where the error is if you've made a small move, as opposed to changing a whole pile of code in your CSS file and then trying to figure out where did I make the modification that's causing me a headache. Small moves go a long way towards alleviating aggravation. So, knowing that, I'll switch back over to my CSS file and continue to make modifications now that I know my width is behaving the way I want. Now I mentioned we could add some margin. So I'm going to add margin on both the left-hand side of my content div, and I'll assign a value of auto. And I'll do the same on the right-hand side. And save my CSS file. And switch back over to my browser and reload. And now I can see that the content is centered no matter how big I make the web browser window. The auto value is telling the browser automatically calculate the amount of vertical space available based on the browser window, take up 800 pixels worth of that and assign that width to the content ID, and then automatically figure out what's left and apply what's left equally on both the left and right-hand side of the screen, giving me this automatically calculated amount of space on the left and right-hand side of the screen.